Close your eyes and take a slow breath. Now imagine that it is not the present day, but somewhere far behind you in time, in a world where the church bell tolls not only for prayer but for punishment, where justice is not served in silence but shouted across the square, where how you are sentenced is as much about your place in society as it is about your crime, and where death is not hidden behind cold stone walls but displayed proudly before the crowd, slow, symbolic, and unforgettable. In the Middle Ages, to be condemned was not merely to be ended, it was to be unwrapped, exposed, and remembered. Every death had its method, and every method had its meaning. Some were swift and clean. Others were drawn out over hours, even days. Some took place before thousands, others before none. But all of them spoke. Tonight, we walk quietly into that world, not as judges, not as victims, but as listeners, to a litany of punishments whispered through time. 20 different ways the medieval world meted out death and what each one tried to say. This is not a horror story, though there is horror here. Nor is it merely history, though every word is rooted in truth. This is something slower, something darker, something strange and still. The past does not shout, it murmurs. And if you're quiet enough, you'll hear how it all began, with footsteps on cobblestone and a scaffold waiting in the mist. The cobbled stones beneath your feet are uneven, worn smooth in places by centuries of tread, by the hesitant shuffle of villagers, drawn by morbid duty, by the slow, shamed pace of those condemned, by the brisk, businesslike boots of guards and judges and grim-faced executioners, who are as much a part of this place as the worn scaffold beams and the ever-watching crowd. You do not walk quickly. You do not run. This is not a place for haste. It is a place for lingering looks, for whispered prayers, for holding your breath at the edge of a gasp. It is the village square, but it is also something else entirely. It is theater, and it is judgment, and it is memory, where what happens here today will echo in talk and tavern song for generations. You have come to witness something, but you are not alone. All around you, villagers gather with a quiet urgency, the way they might gather to see a comet, or a nobleman's parade, or a beast with two heads. They press closer, yet speak softer, their breath catching, as if they are inside a church, not because they are praying, but because they fear that what is about to happen, or what has happened here before, might one day happen to them. Above you the gallows loom, but not just the gallows. A wooden block is there too, stained and gouged with marks that speak of axes and swords and heads that once failed to sever clean. The manner of your death is not chosen for efficiency or mercy. It is chosen for meaning. It is a language, and it speaks of your crime, your class, your soul, and your reputation. In a world where most cannot read, the execution speaks for the state, and the scaffold is its scripture. A thief might dangle from a rope, twisting slowly as the breeze catches his legs. A noblewoman accused of adultery might meet a quiet blade behind high walls, while a witch, or what the villagers call one, is walked barefoot through the square, surrounded by chants, led to the woodpile where fire waits, not as a tool of warmth, but as a doorway to damnation. You pause in your walking. The crowd seems to part slightly ahead of you, not out of courtesy, but out of an unconscious, shivering reverence for what stands at the center of the square. An old man wrapped in coarse wool whispers something to a child. The child nods. The man spits once on the ground. Perhaps he is cursing the condemned. And behind it all, to the far side of the square, there is a pile of old firewood, arranged like a pyre, the kind that doesn't speak of warmth or storytelling, but of fire that devours the living, while the crowd watches and does nothing, except sometimes cheer. Here justice has a shape, it has a sound, it has a smell, and you begin to understand that this is not justice in the way you once thought it to be. It is not a matter of truth or fairness or deliberation. It is something else, older, heavier, and far more terrifying. It is theater with stakes so high that those who step onto the stage do not step off again. The Middle Ages were not a time of swift and invisible punishment. They were not a time when the condemned were quietly removed and neatly dispatched out of sight, out of mind. No, here death is a public ritual, a communal experience. It is spectacle designed to teach, to terrify, and to burn itself into the memories of those who witness it. Perhaps he is cursing the judge. Or perhaps, and this is the most likely, he is simply spitting to keep himself from speaking words that would get him killed too. No one laughs here. Even the drunkards from the tavern across the lane stand quiet, and uneasy mugs forgotten in their hands. For they too know, though they may pretend not to, that the line between the crowd and the condemned is not so very thick. A wrongly spoken word, a wrongly loved person, a wrongly believed faith, and anyone might find themselves beneath the executioner's eye. Guilt and innocence matter far less than usefulness, than confession, than fear. You walk further into the square, and you imagine what it might be like to stand where they stood, the thieves, the heretics, the traitors, the murderers, and the wrongly accused. You imagine the feel of rope around your wrists. You imagine the silence before the axe falls. You imagine the fire licking up your legs, and the crowd gasping, and someone looking away at the last moment, too late. And yet for all this horror, for all the gore and the terror and the cruelty, there is something curiously ordered about it all. Executions have rules. There are rituals. There are announcements, processions, even prayers. There are men in robes and men with axes and men with torches, and each has a part to play. It is not chaos. It is choreography. The bell tolls. Somewhere a clerk unrolls a scroll. A judge adjusts his robe. And the executioner, yes, there he is, calm and quiet, sharpening his blade or adjusting his noose or watching the sky, as if wondering whether it will rain on today's work. This is not just death. This is performance. This is power. And in the chapters to come, you will see how many ways the Middle Ages taught a man or a woman or even a beast to die. Because here in this world of whispering wood and creaking rope, how you die matters. It tells your story whether you wanted it to or not. To understand the strange, terrible poetry of medieval execution, to grasp why the gallows were built so tall, why the wheel was displayed beside the road, why the burning stake was planted in the center of the market square, you must begin with the truth that punishment in the Middle Ages was not simply about removing the guilty from the world, nor was it designed for silent efficiency or quiet conclusion, but rather it was constructed as a tale, a lesson, a visible and visceral narrative etched into the eyes of all who dared to watch, and more importantly, into the minds of all who dared to remember. It was in many ways a kind of theater, though no actor on a page or stage would have envied the fate of those who took center stage in these public performances, and like all good theater. The medieval execution was rich with symbolism. A beheading clean and swift was more than death. It was a mark of nobility, a privilege of high birth, a final acknowledgement that the one who knelt had once stood in courts and parlors and castles, and thus was granted not only the blade's mercy, but the dignity of a clean stage exit, while those of lower standing, those whose lives bore the stain of poverty or common vice, might be given. Instead, the rope, the fire, or the wheel, their ends dragged out, dramatized, exaggerated for effect. For in a world without newspapers, without court transcripts, without viral trials or televised justice, The execution was not the end of a case. It was the telling of a message, a parable made of blood and fire and iron, shaped not only for the condemned, but for the entire village, the entire region, the entire kingdom, even for those who whispered of rebellion, for those who spoke heresy in the dark, for those who dreamed of rising above their station, or doubted the sacred chain of fealty between man and monarch, peasant and priest, soul and sword. And so death became layered, not only a punishment for a crime, but a declaration of identity, a branding of character, a societal judgment passed not just on deeds, but on status, on silence, on belief, and often on usefulness for the condemned, were not always truly guilty, and guilt did not always guarantee execution, for politics played its part, and so did personal grudges and the cruel convenience of a scapegoat. In this world, pain had purpose, and that purpose was not only to cleanse or correct, but to communicate, to shout a warning so loud it could echo for years, and the square, the scaffold, the spike, the fire, the sword, these were all tools of narrative, as much as they were tools of death. Every death was staged not with modern flair, but with ritual precision, with grim ceremony passed down through generations of executioners, magistrates, and town criers, so that each punishment fit not merely the law it reflected, but the performance it demanded. And so just as a bishop might bless a sword, a hangman might soak his rope, a fire tender might gather bundles of dry wood laced with pitch, all to ensure that the moment of death would not pass quietly or quickly, but rather impress itself onto the minds of those who watched so deeply and thoroughly that the memory would pass into story, and the story into warning, and the warning into fear. To be executed was not simply to cease existing. It was to be transformed into a story, one that the village would tell again and again, at first in horror, then in gossip, then in legend, until the truth blurred and faded, and only the moral remained: do not betray your king, do not blaspheme, do not steal the sacred cup, do not love the wrong person, do not dream too boldly. Even the body itself was used to carry the story forward. Heads mounted on spikes above castle gates, their lifeless eyes facing outward like grotesque sentries. Limbs nailed to crossroads to mark the path of crime. Corpses left to rot in gibbet cages suspended above the fields where crows and children alike would see them swinging in the wind, a grisly punctuation mark that no one could ignore. The fear this created was not wild or frantic. It was slow, deep, and constant, like a cold draft in a stone corridor, and it shaped how people lived, how they spoke, how they knelt in confession or bit their tongues in dispute, how they carried themselves through the day and wrapped themselves in prayer before sleep. Because in the Middle Ages, justice was not hidden, it was not sterile, and it was not kind. It was public, symbolic, and deeply personal. And that is where we must begin, not with the deaths themselves, but with what they meant, with the way an execution was less an ending than an announcement, less a silence than a sentence spoken, not by the mouth of the condemned, but by the machinery of the state, the church, the mob, each playing their part, and each echoing the same terrible warning: be careful, be obedient, and above all, be afraid. There is something uniquely dreadful about the way fire behaves when it is not accidental, not a lightning-struck barn, nor a careless hearth, but rather something planned, something prepared, something assembled stick by stick, by hands that know exactly what they are building. Not warmth, not sustenance, but death, and not just death, but purification. For in the mind of the medieval man, fire had meaning beyond destruction. It was a tool of spiritual correction, a divine force borrowed from God himself. And when arranged in a pyre beneath a human body, it became more than punishment. It became a ritual, Around this post, the wood was arranged with quiet, chilling care bundles of dry kindling branches, stripped of bark logs, stacked in such a way that the fire would rise not too quickly. For that would be a mercy, but steadily, cruelly, hungrily, so that it would first warm the feet, then lick the calves, then take the knees, then wrap itself around the torso until the shrieks of the burning were so loud that even the most pious in the crowd had to look away. But they came anyway. Oh, they always came, for the burning of a heretic or a witch was not merely an execution, it was an event, a sermon, a spectacle, and sometimes a festival. Children stood on their fathers' shoulders. Vendors sold roasted nuts and sweetmeats. Priests led hymns. And sometimes, though never officially sanctioned, there was laughter, because in the face of such horror, nervous humor was a shield, and besides the one tied to the post, had been painted as inhuman for so long that by the time the fire reached their chest, the crowd had already convinced itself it was watching something more like wood burn than flesh. But it was flesh, and it did burn, and it smelled, and it screamed, and it cried out to gods who did not answer. And the crowd, in its complicated silence, took the message home: do not question the church. Do not stray from doctrine. Do not think too strangely. Do not speak too boldly. Do not believe that your prayers alone can shield you from fire. To be burned at the stake was not a crime's consequence, so much as a soul's final cleansing. Or so they said, especially when the condemned had been judged not only unlawful, but unholy, a heretic, a blasphemer, a witch, a woman or man, whose words or thoughts or very breath had defied the order of heaven and the dogma of the church. And for such offenses it was believed death by ordinary means would not suffice, because the body was not the only thing at stake. The soul, too, had to be dealt with, and if it could not be saved in life, then perhaps it might be saved in smoke. The stake itself was often little more than a thick wooden post, rough-hewn and sturdy, fixed firmly into the earth, in the center of a square, a courtyard, or more poetically, more horribly in a churchyard, as if to suggest that the condemned, even in their final moment, still stood within reach of the divine, though what that divinity thought of their screams was never questioned aloud. And still others, nameless, voiceless, forgotten, were simply caught in the tide, accused for convenience, sentenced, for example, chosen to remind the rest of the village that belief was not a private thing, that faith could be policed, and that death could come not for what you did, but for what someone said you believed. In the end, the ashes told no tales. The fire left little behind, sometimes a few scorched bones, sometimes the bent iron that had chained a body to the post, sometimes nothing at all but a blackened patch of ground that the villagers avoided for weeks or forever. But the memory remained. The next time someone heard an unusual chant, or saw a woman gathering herbs, or overheard a whispered doubt about the bishop's latest decree, they would remember the fire. Not just the sight of it, but the sound, the smell, the unbearable closeness of the heat, and they would hold their tongue. You might see them before you saw the condemned, the sticks piled in the square, carried in wheelbarrows by village boys who did not yet understand what they were building. Or perhaps they did and simply chose not to think about it. For it was easier, always easier, not to ask questions when the answers came with screams. The faggot became the language of heresy. You did not need to name the flames, the stake, or the executioner. You could simply say that a man was sent with the faggot, or that he wore the faggot on his back, and those who heard you would nod solemnly, or look away, or make the sign of the cross, because they knew what it meant, that the fire had been prepared, and the doctrine was being defended, and a soul, whether guilty or innocent, was about to be boiled from its body in the name of faith. And so, in its own terrible way, the burning stake succeeded not in purifying the soul, but in silencing the living. It begins not with flame, but with wood, dry, brittle, and ordinary, A faggot, they called it. Just a simple bundle of sticks, the sort you might gather for a hearth, or a village oven, the sort that, in a different life, might have warmed your hands or baked your bread. But here, in the twisted theater of medieval justice, it became a symbol not of comfort, but of condemnation, because when a man or woman was accused of heresy, of thinking wrongly of praying, wrongly of reading the wrong text, or doubting the right priest, these small branches became a part of their story. A quiet prop waiting at the edge of the stage, dry as parchment and twice as flammable. There were rituals as always, because medieval death was never a random act. It was ordered, sanctified, soaked in theology and pageantry. And so the heretic would sometimes be offered one last chance to recant, to save their soul, if not their skin, to renounce their beliefs, to declare the truth false and the lie sacred. And if they did, they might be spared the flames, not by pardon, but by postponement, by some lesser punishment, by being marked with a cross of shame, or marched barefoot in penance, or sentenced to a life in a monastery, silent and unseen. But often they refused. Often they stood fast, not because they believed themselves martyrs, though some did, and not because they hoped for rescue, though hope is hard to kill, but because to recant in the face of the fire was to undo the very thing they had been punished for in the first place: their words, their ideas, their faith, their defiance. And so they were bound. Sometimes their confessor, the priest appointed to guide their soul in its final hours, would offer them a kiss, a gentle brush of the lips against the cheek or brow, meant to signify peace, meant to represent forgiveness or compassion, but often feeling to the condemned like betrayal, like a final performance for the crowd, a staged display of piety before the true violence began. And then the fire would be lit, not with sudden fury, but with ceremony, a slow curling of smoke, a creeping glow beneath the sticks, the faggots catching like dry parchment, the first heat rising against skin already trembling with fear, and the body beginning to twist, to strain against the ropes, to pull against the iron chains that held it upright before the crowd. A spectacle of anguish framed by wood and sky. There are records, many records of these deaths, for the church, ever meticulous, kept detailed notes, not only of who died and when, but how they died, what they said as they burned, whether they cried out for mercy or cursed the crowd, whether they sang hymns or screamed incoherent prayers, whether the fire burned cleanly or needed tending, as if the method of death could further define the guilt or innocence of the soul it consumed. And the crowd watched. Always the crowd, for these were not private executions, not hidden affairs. They were public and theatrical, and those who attended did so as both audience and participant, whether they knew it or not, because by their silence, by their presence, by their lack of protest, they became part of the ritual, complicit in the story, even if they turned away when the screams began. For some, the death of a heretic was a relief, a removal of danger, a cleansing of the village. For others, it was a warning, a whispered reminder to guard their thoughts, to hide their books, to nod and smile when the bishop spoke. And when it was over, when the fire had cracked and hissed and finally settled into ash, what remained was not just scorched wood and charred bone, but a memory, a silence, a space where a person had once stood and no longer stood. And in that emptiness, 100 new stories were born. Of what she said before the flames took her, of how bravely he sang, as the fire rose, of how the sky darkened, or a dog barked, or a child began to cry. They were gone, but their deaths, like the faggots that fed the fire, would smolder on in the minds of those who watched, those who whispered, those who wondered, what if it had been me? There is a certain cold elegance to the idea of beheading a final stroke, clean and swift, the blade flashing in the air before the crowd can draw a breath, the body dropping forward in a kneel it will never rise from again, and the head crowned or common rolling softly onto the straw, its face already empty of thought. its eyes still wide with the echo of surprise, and in that single motion, so much is decided, so much is silenced, and so much is remembered. Some who burned were women accused of dancing with devils, of whispering spells in the woods, of birthing children, without pain or without men, or simply of being disliked, unmarried, old, or inconvenient. And though their trials were brief and their confessions often wrung from them with tools that no one dared name, in public their deaths were drawn out because the church said fire was purifying, and one cannot be purified quickly. Others were men scholars who had read too widely, priests who had preached too freely, reformers who had dared to write that God might be understood without a bishop's blessing. And these too burned their books, sometimes tossed into the fire with them, their words vanishing in the same smoke that carried their final breath to the indifferent sky. For to die by the sword or axe was, in the complex and often contradictory logic of the Middle Ages, a privilege, not a cruelty, because the swiftness of the act, the dignity of it even, was considered suitable only for those of noble birth, for those whose status had not been entirely erased by their crimes, for those whose blood, though traitorous, still ran blue enough to warrant a death without torment, without fire, without public dismemberment, or drawn-out suffering beneath the jeering gaze of the town square. And so, though the sentence may have been death, the method whispered something else: you are still one of us, even now, even here, even as you kneel. It was supposed to be quick. That was the promise. A promise made by judges, by executioners, by custom, that the blade would fall true, the blow would be clean, the death would be instant. And yet history is heavy with the burden of broken promises, with the trembling of blades, with the failures of arms not strong enough, or of executioners who missed not once but twice or 3 times or more, while the condemned knelt on straw now slick with blood, their body convulsing, their mouth trying to form words. It no longer had breath to complete. It did not always go well. It did not always go swiftly. Sometimes the axe was dull, a fact known by all but unspoken, or the headsman was drunk or nervous or inexperienced, especially when the condemned was someone of importance, someone whose name would live on in stories, someone whose eyes, when they looked up, seemed to see not just the man who would strike them down, but all those who had ordered it all, those who would cheer it, and all those who would regret it too late. There is, for instance, the story whispered, half-believed, and retold endlessly of the queen who met her death with a prayer on her lips, whose executioner was so clumsy, so slow, that it took several strikes to sever her neck. The blade biting again and again, while the crowd turned pale and still, the horror mounting with every unfinished blow. The grace of noble death transformed into something crude and ghastly, a mockery of justice clothed in velvet. Sometimes it was the sword instead of the axe, a finer blade, a more graceful cut, but one that demanded precision training and nerve, for this was no execution of the common sort, no lurching rope or burning pyre, but a ceremony, almost a duel, in which the condemned knelt still and straight, and the swordsman, often imported from abroad, if local skill could not be trusted, raised the steel with silent reverence and brought it down not with rage but with duty, with ritual, with a kind of mournful respect. The body was usually taken quickly, the head too, but not always. In some cases, the head was lifted by the hair turned to face the crowd, shown to the people, so that all might see the traitor or the heretic or the queen who had once ruled them, and in that moment some swore, the lips still moved, or the eyes still blinked, or the mouth gasped as if trying to breathe. And though science would one day explain these as nerves or reflexes in that age, they were read as signs of guilt, of innocence, of defiance, or of some unquiet spirit refusing to go quietly into death. For the people watching, the message was clear. This was justice. This was order maintained. This was what happened when one reached too far, or spoke too freely, or loved too wrongly, or prayed outside the lines drawn by power. And yet beneath the pomp and the terror, there was something undeniably human in the scene. The kneeling figure alone among the crowd, waiting for a blade that would come when it came, trusting a stranger, with the clean cut that would end all things, and hoping above all things that the headsman would not hesitate. Because in that moment, the executioner was not merely a killer, but a kind of priest offering not just death, but mercy in its delivery, dignity in its speed, grace in the precision of a single unforgiving motion. And when the blade did its work well, and the blood pooled quietly, and the body sagged without protest, and the head lay still and clean beside it, the people exhaled not in joy, but in a strange, guilty relief. For some deaths were not feared because they were violent. Some deaths were feared because they could go wrong. And in the cold geometry of the axe and the block, where every inch and every second mattered, one mistake could turn nobility into nightmare. The difference between a sword and an axe, when both are used not for war or defense, but for the quiet, terrible work of execution, may seem like a small thing, a matter of steel, of shape, of edge and arc, and yet in the long shadow of medieval justice, where punishment was as much a statement as a sentence, and where the method mattered nearly as much as the reason, the choice between blade and axe was anything but trivial, for it spoke of lineage, of class, of ceremony, and above all, of how death itself was permitted to unfold, whether as a clean, quick ritual of status, or as a grimmer, more public ordeal of brute efficiency. The sword, long, slender, sharpened, not for hacking, but for slicing, for cutting, with a whisper of steel through flesh and spine, was not given to just any executioner, nor was it raised above just any neck, but reserved for the nobility, for lords and ladies, who, though judged guilty, still carried the echoes of high birth, and were thus deemed deserving of a death marked not by spectacle, but by solemnity. And so when such a death was called for, the condemned would often kneel not upon a stained block in the center of a bustling square, but upon a cloth-draped platform or within the courtyard of a castle surrounded by silent witnesses and sober attendants, each holding their breath as the swordsman stepped forward with the quiet confidence of one who understood that the work must be done not quickly, but perfectly. The sword was a performer's weapon, not in the sense of theater, though execution was always theater of a kind, but in the sense that it required grace, strength, and precision in equal measure, for to miss was not only to fail in one's task, but to bring shame upon the craft, agony to the condemned, and murmurs of incompetence or cruelty to the ears of the watching court. And so many a swordsman often brought in from distant cities, even foreign lands, trained tirelessly, learning not merely how to kill, but how to kill correctly, how to make the cut so clean that the head fell with dignity, with silence, with almost surgical decorum. The axe, by contrast, was a humbler thing, heavier, broader, forged not for elegance but for power, a weapon of laborers and woodsmen repurposed into a tool of the law, its great weight lending it force enough to part bone and muscle with a single thunderous blow. And because it was cruder and because it was easier to wield, without years of study or art, it became the instrument of more common deaths. Its rough iron edge matched to the rough fate of thieves, traitors, and peasants, who were never promised a clean cut, only an ending. Where the sword demanded silence, the axe invited noise, the jeer of the crowd, the thump of the block, the dull crack of impact followed sometimes by a second blow or a third, and the awful gasp that followed when it became clear that the first strike had failed, that the executioner's hands were shaking, or that the condemned had moved, or that fate itself had intervened to prolong the agony, as if to make the death not only physical, but emotional, a lesson carved into time, and witnessed by all. There were customs, of course, even for the axe, and moments of stillness before the strike when the executioner might whisper a brief prayer, or the condemned might forgive his killer, or the crowd might fall to hush, waiting for the sound that would follow. And when it came, whether swift or delayed, whether a clean snap or a series of grotesque chops, the result was the same. A head severed, a life ended, and a justice satisfied, or more accurately, a justice performed. In rare cases, nobles were denied the sword not for lack of rank, but as an additional insult, a symbolic degradation, a stripping of privilege meant to underscore their fall from favor. And to such condemned figures, the axe was not merely a tool, it was an indignity, a final reminder that status was not immune to ruin, and that when kings grew angry or kingdoms turned cruel, even blue blood could be spattered across common wood. And yet, as different as the sword and the axe may have been, as different as the silk-robed kneeling lord was from the ragged thief pressed to the block, the final moment was always the same. The breath held, the blade raised, the last thought flashing like light behind the eyes, and then the sudden end. The swift unmaking of a life not by nature's hand, but by laws, by man's, by steel. There is a kind of stillness in this contrast. The blade of a sword singing through the air like a whispered apology. The head falling gently like a leaf, and the brutal thud of an axe that cleaves not only bone, but silence replacing solemnity with shock. And it is in this difference that the medieval world revealed its values, who was worthy of grace, who was consigned to brutality, and how every swing of metal was both punishment and message, both an ending and an exclamation. In the hands of a trembling man, both sword and axe could fail, but when used with confidence, they wrote two different kinds of death into history. One sharp and swift like a bell in winter, the other too heavy and hard like the cracking of a tree trunk in the woods. There is a certain inevitability to the gallows, a blunt finality in the way they rise from the edge of the town, like the arm of a giant caught mid-gesture, reaching not to save but to suspend, not to lift, but to let drop a wooden frame as plain as a barn door, and yet more feared than the blade or the flame. For the gallows belonged not to nobility or the heretical or the political, but to the ordinary criminal, the hungry thief, the muttering beggar, the deserter, the drunkard, the desperate man who stole a loaf of bread and ran only to be caught and brought back and shown to all with a rope around his neck. And the sentence read aloud, not because it was unusual, but because it was expected, because the gallows, more than any other instrument of execution, were for everyone. The condemned came by cart, or walked barefoot sometimes, singing, sometimes weeping, always watched by guards, by priests, by executioners in coarse black cloth and gloved hands, and most of all by the crowd which thickened as the hour drew near. Not with reverence, but with murmurs and movement. Children darting between legs, dogs barking, vendors shouting over the clatter of hooves and wheels, the whole town pressed together like grains of wheat in a sack, waiting for the moment when the condemned would mount the steps and the rope would be pulled taut. And though it was supposed to be simple, a short drop, a snap, a quiet swinging in the wind, it was rarely so clean. Unlike the block or the stake or the wheel, which required preparation, construction, and solemnity, the gallows were always there, always waiting. Their beams weathered by rain and sun, their nooses coiled neatly when not in use, their steps creaking with memory, and their shadow stretching long across the grass or dirt or cobbled stone where the people gathered, drawn not by justice but by something stranger, something darker, a kind of need to witness what might become of them if the wind changed, if the bread spoiled, if the Lord grew angry, if God looked away for just a moment too long. Because the human body is not a fixed machine, and the noose is not a precise instrument, And though hangings were meant to be swift, many were slow, horribly so, the condemned kicking, twisting, gasping for air that would not come, their legs dancing, a grotesque farewell as the crowd grew still, then restless, then whispering again, debating whether the man was truly guilty, whether the punishment fit the crime, whether God was watching this, or whether he had already turned away. Sometimes the hangman paid poorly, often, drunk, sometimes nervous, misjudged the knot or the weight or the length of the rope, and instead of a neck broken instantly, there was strangulation, a drawn-out struggle that could last minutes, endless minutes, with the body convulsing, the face darkening, the lips swelling, the tongue pushing out in a swollen mockery of speech, while the people watched with a kind of helpless fascination, unable to intervene and unwilling to look away. And there were worse mistakes. The rope snapping the beam, cracking the trapdoor, jamming the condemned, falling and surviving, groaning, crawling, gasping on the ground before being hoisted again. The punishment resumed like a play with no intermission, and the crowd unsure whether they were watching justice or cruelty, or whether those two words meant the same thing after all. But the ritual continued. Because it had to. Because the gallows were not just a place to die, they were a place to perform the idea of consequence, to teach by example, to frighten by spectacle, to remind by repetition that the law had hands, and those hands would grip your throat if you stepped too far into the gray between sin and survival. And the aftermath was never clean either. The bodies sometimes remained for hours, even days, left to swing in the sun, or rain, their clothes flapping in the wind, their limbs stiffening into strange, unnatural shapes. Crows gathering at the edges of the crowd, and waiting always. Waiting because the line between execution and exposure was thin, and a hanged man was useful even in death, useful as a message, a marker, a meatless warning swaying slowly above the road. Children remembered their faces. Women crossed themselves. Old men spat. And the rope once used was not discarded, it was cut into pieces and sold, passed from hand to hand as a relic, a talisman, a ward against evil, or a charm for luck, depending on whether you believed the rope had stolen a soul or merely loosed it. The condemned had names sometimes forgotten, sometimes written in records that no one read, sometimes spoken for years after in ballads, in curses, in lullabies, whispered half in fear, for the gallows haunted not only the living, but the language itself, leaving behind phrases like dancing the hangman's jig, or he'll swing for it, scraps of sentence born from broken necks and hollow chests. And in the end, the gallows never moved. It was the people who did passing by it on market days, glancing at it on the way to church, pretending not to notice it, in the fog or the fading light, knowing it would still be there tomorrow, just as it had been yesterday, just as it might one day be waiting for them, or someone they loved, or someone they envied, or someone they would never speak of again. Because in the Middle Ages, the gallows weren't feared for their wood, or their rope, or even their height. The crowd which had come expecting justice found themselves instead watching a kind of prolonged suffering that neither felt righteous nor felt avoidable, but simply unfolded before them, minute after minute, until the condemned went still, and the wind moved them gently like a branch in winter. And for some, this slow, uneven death was fitting a payment earned by crime. But for others, for children, for mothers, for those whose doubt was louder than their faith, it was not justice, but punishment for its own sake, a mistake repeated because it was tradition, not truth. They were feared for how ordinary they were, how always present, how ready, how easily they could go from silent structure to center stage. If the gallows stood as a symbol of justice, visible, public, unyielding, then the drop beneath it, the space between the condemned's feet and the earth they once walked upon, was its cruel punctuation, a gap that promised finality and delivered all too often something slower, stranger, and far more disturbing than the clean, swift end the crowd was told to expect. For in the world of medieval hanging, there was no single method, no standardized formula, no scientific precision applied to the mechanics of death. Only variations born of custom convenience and terrible misunderstanding, and those variations had names whispered by those who watched and remembered the short drop, the long drop, and the no drop at all. The short drop, the most common method in early medieval Europe, was in truth not much of a drop at all, for the condemned was typically lifted or pushed from a cart or stool or ladder, not with force or ceremony, but with a simple, often sloppy motion that left them dangling from the rope, not snapped out of life in an instant, but strangled slowly, the noose tightening with every twitch, the throat crushed, not by impact, but by time. And in this grotesque limbo of breathlessness, death took its time, sometimes 3 minutes, sometimes more than 10, the victim kicking, clawing, convulsing, as their body sought air that would never come, their face first, red, then purple, then gray, their eyes bulging not with horror, but with need. Then there was the long drop, not medieval in its origin, but imagined toward the end of the period, as whispers of better methods trickled in from other lands, and minds began to wrestle with the idea that death could be both final and fast, a calculated fall in which the length of the drop was measured against the prisoner's weight, the height chosen with care so that the moment the body fell, the neck would break instantly, snapping the spine between the second and third vertebrae, killing the person so swiftly that the rope became not a torment, but a blade made of gravity. And yet even here mistakes were common, for if the drop was too short, the result was merely strangulation, again, a return to the old method under the illusion of progress. But if the drop was too long, then something worse could happen, something whispered about in fear and revulsion, for the body, given too much momentum, could be torn apart. The head ripped from the shoulders, the crowd showered with horror, and the executioner left shaken not by pity, but by the knowledge that what was meant to be controlled had turned into something monstrous. And worst of all, perhaps, was the no drop, a phrase that sounds like mercy, but is in fact its opposite, when the condemned was hanged not by falling, but by lifting, by slowly tightening the rope from above, or hauling the body upward from a beam. The feet dragged from the earth, the arms flailing, the choking drawn out even longer than any drop might allow, a method often used in prisons in hidden places, where death was not meant to be seen, but still had to be done. And in such places it was not the crowd that bore witness, but the walls, the damp stone, the rat, and the chain, and the priest, whose eyes did not meet yours. In every variation, failure was possible, and failure meant not escape, but suffering. Sometimes the rope slipped and the condemned fell to the ground, coughing and bruised and still alive, only to be dragged up and hanged again. Sometimes the knot was tied wrong, and instead of catching the throat, it crushed the jaw or slipped beneath the chin, turning the death into something even less predictable, even more gruesome. Sometimes the scaffold cracked, or the beam sagged, and the whole thing collapsed under the weight of error. And in every case, the crowd remembered. They remembered the screams, the jerking limbs, the sound of the neck refusing to snap, the long moments between drop and death, when the condemned was neither here nor gone, suspended in suffering, while the world stared and debated whether they were getting what they deserved. These memories stayed. There are punishments that kill, and there are punishments that mean to destroy, not merely to end a life, but to erase the person behind it, to shatter them in body, spirit, reputation, and memory, to tear them apart so thoroughly that even the thought of them, the echo of their name or the trace of their belief becomes dangerous, becomes something one does not speak aloud. And perhaps the most infamous of these was the fate reserved for the traitor, the one who had not only broken the law, but defied the crown, challenged the divine order, placed self above sovereign, and in doing so committed an unthinkable sin, in the eyes of medieval kings, a sin that could not be answered with a single death, but demanded a performance of pain so elaborate, so gruesome, and so symbolic, that it would not merely execute a man, but make him an example carved across the very landscape of the nation. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was to be sentenced not to die once, but 4 times, and in 4 different ways, each one darker, slower, and more theatrical than the last. A sequence of punishments designed less to satisfy justice, and more to satisfy fear, to flood the watching crowd with a sense of awe and terror, to brand the event into their minds, so that none who witnessed it could ever forget what happens to those who betray their king, their country, or the strange, shimmering idea of divine order that bound the two together. It began always with the hanging, but not to the death, no, never to the death, for that would be mercy, that would be too fast, too clean, too final. And mercy was the one thing this ritual refused to offer. Instead, the traitor was led or dragged to the gallows, often through the city streets, on a wooden hurdle or plank, lashed down and jostled for hours. His face smeared with mud, his body battered by stones and jeers from the crowd, his name already cursed before the rope even touched his neck. And when he arrived, the noose was set loosely, deliberately, so that when he was dropped, the fall would tighten, but not snap, the neck would strangle, but not kill, and he would twist and gasp and dangle until the executioner at the right moment, the dramatic moment, cut him down, wheezing, shuddering, perhaps unconscious, but still alive enough to suffer what was still to come. Then came the drawing, a word that in modern ears might sound like something gentle, as if with chalk or ink, but in the cruel lexicon of medieval punishment meant something far worse: the slitting open of the abdomen, the slow, deliberate pulling out of the intestines, the organs, the soft and vulnerable parts of the body laid bare, while the condemned still breathed, sometimes tied upright, sometimes laid out flat, held down not just by ropes, but by duty. And as the crowd watched, a fire might be lit beside him, not to warm, but to roast. For often the entrails were burned before the victim's eyes, a spectacle of smoke and agony meant to mimic the fires of hell itself, a message that not only had the traitor betrayed his earthly king, but his eternal soul as well. And still it was not done, because the worst, the final act, the quartering, had yet to unfold. They were passed along in whispers, in cautionary tales, in tavern mutterings, and bedtime warnings. Not because the people loved cruelty, but because they feared it, because they needed to understand it, because they believed with good reason that what happened to the man on the rope could one day happen to them, and so they watched and remembered and tried to make sense of it. But the truth, if there was one, lay not in the height of the drop, or the speed of the fall, or the silence of the priest's prayer, but in the terrible, simple fact that justice by rope was always a gamble, a performance without rehearsal, a death that might go well or might go wrong. And when it went wrong, it did not fade quietly into history. It lived on, swinging in the mind long after the body was still. Only once the man was nearly dead, or finally allowed to die from shock or blood loss or pain, would the body be taken down, stretched out, and divided, not with care, but with ceremony, limbs hacked from torso with axe or blade, each arm and leg separated from the trunk in a kind of grim arithmetic, or parts of one whole now rendered into pieces, not to be buried, but to be displayed, because this was not just execution, it was a warning carved into the world itself. The head once removed might be spiked upon a gate. London Bridge was a favorite, a grisly beacon watching the river pass below, while the limbs were sent to the corners of the kingdom, nailed to the walls of cities and castles, placed above gates beneath which thousands walked daily. Glancing upward, not in curiosity but in dread, reminded with every step that treason was not a private matter, that the state did not merely punish rebellion, it devoured it, dismembered it, scattered it until even the wind bore witness to the crime. And the crowd, though sickened, though pale, though hushed or trembling or numb, did not leave. They stayed. Because to witness such a death was to be folded into the ritual, to become part of the process, to carry the story forward, in gossip, in warning, in bedtime whispers, meant to keep sons loyal and daughters silent, for what they had seen was not just a man's end, but a kingdom's defense, a monarch's vengeance, a god's supposed justice. There were those even among executioners who spoke later of trembling hands, of sleepless nights, of the quiet sobs of victims who no longer cursed, but prayed, of the eyes that stared up, not in defiance, but in a kind of hollow pleading, asking not for pardon, but for speed. And yet the sentence continued year after year, body after body, king after king, because while most forms of execution sought only to end, this one sought to erase, to reduce the traitor, not just to death, but to parts, to ash, to fear, to nothing. And in that nothing, the silence of obedience was born. There is something deeply unsettling in the way the medieval city wore its punishments, not hidden behind closed doors or buried quietly beneath the earth, but lifted high above the heads of its people, stretched across gates and towers, nailed to posts, spiked atop bridges and walls, as if the city itself were wearing the remains of the condemned like a grotesque crown. And it was not by accident, not by neglect, but by design, a display meant to linger, to rot in the sun, and stiffen in the frost, to drip onto the cobbles, and to haunt the dreams of all who passed below, for in this world of signs and symbols, a body was never just a body. It was a message. The death had already happened, the sentence already carried out. The lungs deflated the heart, stilled the soul, if there was such a thing departed. But the story was not yet complete. Not until the remains were made visible. Not until they were shown to the public in a way that could not be ignored, not whispered about behind hands, but shouted without words from the parapets and arches, from the shadowed corners of the portcullis, and the long curve of the stone gate, where people entered and exited each day, glancing up without meaning to, and seeing not statues or saints or banners, but heads. Severed heads, not always fresh, not always clean, mounted on iron spikes like grotesque fruit, their faces frozen in whatever expression death had left them. With a scream, a snarl, a sagging mouth half open in protest or prayer, their hair stiff with dried blood, their skin graying, curling, peeling beneath the heat of the sun or the sharp bite of the wind. And as the weeks passed and the flies came and the birds picked at the soft places, the mouths lost their shape, the eyes sank, and the teeth became exposed in a grin that had no joy, only a kind of hollow, mocking permanence. And yet these heads remained because they had a job to do. They were reminders. They were warnings. They were proof that justice had been done and could be done again, and would be done again should anyone doubt the authority of crown or church or city magistrate. And so when a man was hanged for treason, or a woman burned for sorcery, or a thief broken for his crimes, their death did not end at the scaffold or stake or wheel. It continued in the architecture of fear, built not with stone, but with flesh. Some heads were placed on London Bridge, a place of traffic, of commerce, of life, where merchants crossed, and barges drifted, and children laughed on the riverbanks below, and yet high above them the traitor's head grinned in eternal silence, its presence both tolerated and expected, a normal part of the skyline, the way that birds or clouds might be. And as the years passed and the spikes grew crowded, old skulls were quietly removed and tossed into the Thames, their replacements already on their way, because the stream of the condemned never quite stopped. Other parts, arms, legs, hands, were nailed to gates and towers in the towns from which the condemned had come, so that neighbors, friends, even family, might see a familiar shape hanging limp above the road, and know that resistance was not abstract, that betrayal had a name and a face, or once had, and that face had been removed not only from the body, but from life. Children were taught to look away, but they looked. Vendors sold bread in the shadow of the dead. Lovers kissed beneath beams that creaked with the weight of justice. And no one pretended not to notice, not really, because the purpose of the display was not to shock that would fade, but to normalize fear, to place the punishment into the everyday, to make it so ordinary that the image of a decaying face on a spike was no longer unbearable, but instructional, something one learned from the way one learned to count coins or tie knots, a basic truth of survival. For those who were forced to maintain these grim decorations, the guards who cleaned the posts, the executioners who carried the heads wrapped in cloth or slung in baskets, the poor souls tasked with climbing ladders and hammering cold nails into still warm wrists. It was work nothing more necessary and grim and as unquestionable as plowing or mending or praying. And yet even they, it is said, would sometimes wake in the night, with the faces still flickering behind their eyes. Not the faces of the famous, the rebels or heretics or would-be kings, but the common ones, the young ones, the ones who had looked afraid, who had asked for their mothers, who had screamed when the blade came down. And those were the faces that stayed, not because they were known, but because they were ordinary. Not every display was met with horror. Sometimes it inspired cheers. Sometimes children threw stones at the corpses. Sometimes flowers were laid below them. Sometimes people prayed. It was used not often, but memorably, for those who would not enter a plea, who would not confess guilt or claim innocence, who stood before the law and said nothing. Not because they had no words, but because they understood what words could do for, in a system where property could be seized from the convicted, where a guilty man's land was forfeit, where his children might be left with nothing. Silence became a shield, a way of dying without betraying the living. And in that space between truth and strategy, the crushing began. It did not happen quickly. Nothing about it was quick. The accused was taken to a dark place, often beneath the court itself, a chamber or a dungeon, where the sun did not reach, where no scaffold waited, and no flame danced, where the death was private, but no less brutal for its privacy. And there the man, or sometimes the woman, was laid on the cold stone floor, flat on their back, arms, outstretched legs together, as if in parody of a prayer, and a wooden board, or iron plate, was placed across the chest, not to kill, not yet, but to begin the waiting. Then came the stones. One by one, at first, smooth river rocks or heavy paving stones or sometimes chunks of broken masonry. Whatever was close at hand, each one placed with care, not dropped, not thrown, but set gently as if the executioner were building something rather than destroying, as if this were a ritual of construction rather than deconstruction. And in a way it was because what they were building was pressure, slow and steady, a weight that grew with every breath the prisoner could barely take, a weight that whispered one thing and one thing only, speak, and it ends. At first it was bearable. The body could hold. The ribs creaked, but did not break the chest. Rose in shallow gulps, the spine pressed flat into the floor, but the pain was manageable, the silence intact. But the body is not built for this. But always, always the body was part of the message. The final sentence of a story written in screams, sealed in blood, and displayed in silence. And in that silence, something ancient echoed a truth too heavy to say aloud, but understood. In the marrow, this is what happens when you forget your place. Among all the forms of death that the medieval world devised, among all the ways the body could be broken, burned, hung, flayed, torn, or scattered, there was one that spoke not through bloodshed or public spectacle, but through weight, through silence, through the slow and remorseless pressure of stone upon bone, through the patient language of crushing, where the punishment was not about what you had done but what you refused to say, a death by refusal, a death by resistance, a death by silence, and it was known in that grim corner of justice as pressing, or in the colder tongue of the court, peine forte et dure, the strong and hard punishment. As the stones continued and the weight grew heavier, each breath became narrower, shallower, more desperate, the ribs bowing inward, like the walls of a collapsing house, the organs beneath them beginning to panic, the blood pushed into strange corners of the body, the heart straining like a trapped bird, the limbs going numb, the mind dimming and flaring and dimming again in waves of pressure and pain and fading air. Sometimes the prisoner would cry out not in pain, but in compromise. They would beg to speak. They would whisper the plea they had held back. They would offer the word guilty just to make the stones stop. But by then it was too late, because once the pressing began, it rarely stopped. There are many ways to be found guilty in the Middle Ages, through confession freely given, through confession torn from the throat by iron instruments and sleepless nights, through the trembling finger of a neighbor who feared for their own soul more than they loved yours, through the eyes of a magistrate who had already made up his mind before you ever stood before him. But perhaps the most peculiar and quietly terrifying was not to be found guilty at all, but to stand before the court and say nothing, not in defiance, not in madness, not even in fear, but in silence, a silence so complete that it became a kind of rebellion, a last flickering of control in a world that allowed you no choices, no defense, and no real chance. And it was in this silence, this refusal to plead either guilty or innocent, that the strange ritual of the silent trial took its shape. The mercy was in death, not in confession, and many of those who tried to plead beneath the stones were told their words no longer mattered, that the judgment was already passed, that they would be pressed until they died, because silence had been their crime, and silence had to be punished with finality. The body, when it broke, did so quietly. Ribs cracked like old wood in fire. The lungs collapsed inward. The tongue sometimes protruded, swollen and blackened. The eyes bulged. The limbs twitched. The chest ceased to rise, and still the stones were added, because death, like guilt, had to be certain. Those who watched the clerks, the jailers, the priests, often turned away near the end, not because they doubted the law, but because the law had become unbearable to witness. And when it was done, the board was removed, the stones lifted, and the body was left flat and strange thinner than it had been, as if the very soul had been squeezed out along with the last breath. What was left was not a body as we understand it, but a thing crushed, a thing compressed, a warning shaped in silence. And that was the point. This was not meant to be a death remembered for spectacle or sound. It was a death remembered for the quiet horror of its process, for the weight of it literal and symbolic, for the simple, unbearable truth that one could be killed not for what one said, but for choosing not to speak. Even now, centuries later, the idea of it lingers. The slow building of pressure, the refusal to plead, the stones one by one laid like accusations, and the final breath flattened beneath the weight of justice. It was an act both courageous and desperate, for to refuse to plead meant refusing the trial itself, refusing to play your part in the theater of judgment, refusing to let the court wrap its language around your fate. But the law, bound by its own strange logic, could not simply skip the steps, could not leap over your silence to reach the sentence. And so it turned instead to peine forte et dure, the strong and harsh punishment, which was not just a sentence but a threat whispered into the very foundation of justice. If you do not speak, we will crush the silence from your lungs. And so it began, not with shouting, not with swordplay or shrieking mobs, but with paperwork and protocol, with the calm voice of a clerk, recording that the accused stands mute, with the judge's solemn intonation that silence is not permitted, and that punishment must now proceed. And from that moment on, the law became a machine with no reverse grinding forward, with the inevitability of gravity, until the stones began to fall. But before the weight came, the question asked once, twice, 3 times, "Will you plead?" And sometimes the answer was a bowed head, or a stare that refused to blink, or lips clamped shut until they cracked. And then the pressing began, the slow stacking of stone upon chest, not out of rage but out of ceremony, because this too was law, and law had no heart. And the silence itself, once a choice, became the loudest part of the punishment, because it denied the court its language, denied the crowd its drama, denied the church its narrative of sin and repentance. And this was what made it so dangerous, that a man, even without title or wealth or sword, could still say no. Not with words, but with the absence of them, and in that absence hold back the gears of justice for just a moment longer. Most who began in silence did not end in it. They screamed or pleaded or wept or gave in. They changed their minds as the weight grew heavier, as ribs creaked and the breath shallowed, as the blood throbbed in their skulls, and their teeth cracked from clenching. And they cried out not just for mercy, but for speech itself. "I plead, I confess, I submit." And this is what makes the silent trial so haunting, that it is not about the spectacle of execution, but about the eerie stillness that comes before it. The quiet refusal that disrupts the pageantry of punishment, that shakes the structure of law with its very absence, and the way the system responded, not with reconsideration, but with weight, with the relentless application of force, as though the very air must be squeezed from the lungs of those who dared to say nothing. To stand mute in the court was to declare that the game itself was rigged. To refuse to plead was to say, "I know how this ends, but I will not give you the satisfaction of my cooperation." And so the weight came, the board, the stones, the silence replaced by gasping, by cracking, by the low and terrible moan that comes from a chest half crushed, until at last there was no sound at all, only the memory of a silence that had meant something, however briefly. Among the many ways a person could be executed in the medieval world, from the sudden finality of the sword to the gradual horror of the wheel, few carried with them the raw, visceral dread of boiling. Not simply because it was painful, though it most certainly was, and not solely because it was slow, though that too was part of its horror, but because there was something uniquely unnatural in the act. Something theatrical and intimate and alchemical, as though the human body had become an ingredient in a public cauldron of punishment. Its skin not sacred, its breath not protected by last rites or final prayers, but reduced instead to bubbles and steam and the soft, appalling hiss of meat unraveling in broth. The condemned would be brought forward, often bound, always wide-eyed, their skin already damp with sweat from the nearness of the fire, their nostrils filled with the sharp, metallic scent of the pot. And the crowd, which had gathered as it always did, drawn not by justice but by the strange magnetism of human suffering, would murmur and shuffle and crane their necks to see what could not possibly be real, and yet was a person, a living, breathing person, being hoisted by rope or lifted by hook, or sometimes made to climb a small ladder into the pot themselves, and then slowly, always slowly, lowered into the scalding liquid. To be boiled alive was not a punishment applied casually, nor even often, but when it was chosen, usually for those accused of poisoning, that most secretive and hated form of betrayal. It was chosen with purpose as a message crafted not for the soul of the condemned, but for the eyes and ears and terrified imagination of the watching crowd. For poisoning was feared not only because it killed, but because it killed quietly, without the sound of steel or the stain of visible wounds, and the medieval mind, deeply rooted in the belief that punishment should fit the nature of the crime, chose boiling, as a way of reversing that secrecy, making the hidden horror public, drawing it out into the square, into the firelight, into the reek and roar of a punishment no one could ignore. The cauldron was not symbolic. It was real, immense, often iron blackened by years of use for food or oil or tallow, placed over a roaring fire in the center of a courtyard, or square where the heat licked up around its belly, and the water or oil within began to quiver, then roll, then leap, until the entire pot surged and spat and frothed with anticipation. And the executioners, masked, sometimes cloaked against the heat, stirred it slowly with long wooden poles, not out of necessity but out of ritual, as if making soup, as if preparing a feast for no one. A feast no one could ever forget. But by then the ritual was in motion, and the stones kept falling, and the silence they had broken no longer mattered, because once the sentence of pressing had begun, there was rarely a pause, only pressure, only pain, only the flattening of the body beneath the law's cold indifference. Yet there were those who held their silence to the end, who refused to utter a single word, not because they believed they would survive, but because the words would cost their family everything, for if they were tried and convicted, their land, their house, their livelihood would be seized. But if they died untried, their estate remained intact. Their children might still eat their name, might still be whispered with respect instead of spat with shame. And so they endured not for themselves, but for those left behind, their silence, not stubbornness, but sacrifice, a final act of protection in a world that gave them no way to protect. King Henry VIII famously issued an edict that poisoners should be boiled because their crime was too hidden, too cowardly, too dangerous to answer with ordinary death. And so the practice, though rare, was formalized, sanctioned, and carried out, its reputation lingering long after the fire had cooled, and the pot had been emptied, long after the ash had been swept away, and the bones buried deep beneath the soil. Because boiling was not meant to be forgotten. It was meant to haunt, to sit at the edges of sleep, to remind every cook, every servant, every alchemist and apothecary and scheming soul with a vial of something bitter and white, that should they dare to mix murder into a cup, their own body might one day become a recipe, one that would be written not in ink but in screams. It is one thing when death comes by tradition, when the gallows creak because they always have, when the sword is raised because it is expected, when the stake is lit, because the ritual demands it, but it is something entirely different, entirely darker, entirely more troubling, when death is invented, not by custom or cleric or common law, but by the crown itself, when the king in his robes and silence and God-given majesty decides that the ordinary forms of punishment are not enough, that the crime affronts not only law, but his person, his dignity, his image, and thus must be answered, not with common execution, but with something new, something rare, something designed not merely to end a life, but to etch fear into the skin of the living, into the bones of the nation, into the stones of the realm. And so it was in moments of fury or fear or sovereign whim that the cauldron returned not as a tool of accident or superstition, but as a crown-sanctioned engine of horror. Because to watch such a death was to be changed, not purified, not educated, but scorched a little on the inside, as if the fire beneath the pot had reached out to touch something behind the eyes. And that was perhaps the true purpose of boiling, not just to kill the poisoner, but to poison the crowd, in turn, with the fear of ever becoming them. For those who administered the punishment, the royal agents, the sheriffs, the chosen executioners, the work was grim beyond imagining, and there are whispers, never written down officially, of men who drank themselves to sleep for weeks afterward, or who refused to speak of what they had seen, or who abandoned the trade altogether, choosing to break rocks or dig graves, rather than lift another body into a boiling cauldron. And yet for a time the law called for it. It is said, And here the records flicker between fact and echo, that King Henry VIII, already a man whose name was fast becoming synonymous with calculated cruelty and the casual severing of heads, did not merely tolerate boiling as punishment, but commanded it, issuing a royal decree that poisoners whose crime was seen as treachery in liquid form, a quiet, cowardly betrayal that slipped past guards and blades and struck directly at the king's household, should no longer be granted the relative dignity of the axe or the rope or the fire, but should instead be boiled alive, their punishment mirroring their crime, their flesh cooked as they had cooked their victim's fate. And in so doing, their death would serve not just as retribution, but as a warning stirred into every goblet, every cup of mead, every bowl of soup passed in silence across a royal table. For the king's justice was never truly about fairness. It was about theater, about power, about the dazzling, terrifying notion that the ruler's will could become flame and rope and oil. And this idea was known, understood, accepted even by a people who had long since been taught that kings ruled not by merit, but by divine right, by blood, by stars, and that to cross a king was not merely to break a rule, but to unravel the order of the world. And if that unraveling demanded screams and steam and skin that peeled away in the rising heat, then so be it. Not all of them, not all the time. Some turned away, some wept, some crossed themselves and fled. But enough stayed, enough remembered enough, carried the image home with them like a splinter beneath the skin. Something they could not dig out, no matter how many times they prayed for. The wheel was not only about justice, it was about fear, about making sure the soul remembered what the flesh had suffered. In later years, stories would grow around the wheel stories of mercy blows, when the executioner, either out of compassion or boredom, would strike the chest or skull to bring about a faster death, and other stories, darker ones of wheels that turned slowly in the night, of ghosts with broken limbs, dragging themselves through village lanes of voices calling for an end that never came. But the truth, if we stay with it, if we let it breathe, is simpler than all the myths. A person was laid on the ground. Their body was broken, and their brokenness was made public. Of all the instruments of death that rose from the dark and careful imagination of medieval justice, the blade that fell clean, the rope that swung slow, the flame that licked skyward, perhaps none was more feared, more whispered of, more cloaked in a kind of unholy grandeur than the wheel, the breaking wheel, the Catherine wheel, though St. Catherine herself, they say, escaped its terror by miracle and not mercy for the real wheel, the one built of thick spokes and iron-banded wood, the one that creaked and splintered beneath the weight of punishment, the one that turned men not into martyrs, but into mangled memories, was not a relic of sainthood, but a tool of unbearable cruelty, crafted to transform the human body into a map of pain, each bone a path, each joint a destination for suffering, carefully measured and publicly delivered. The condemned would be brought to the place of execution, a hill, a crossroads, a field where carts no longer came, and there the wheel would be waiting, its surface washed in sunlight, or shadow depending on the hour, and those who gathered to watch. And there were always many would feel something deep inside them recoil at the sight of it. Not because it was sharp or grotesque, but because it was simple, ordinary, even a wheel like any other, like those that carried goods or groaned under wagons. And yet here it had been transformed into an altar of unmaking a device, not of transport, but of torment, not of motion, but of stillness, as the body it touched would never move again in any way that mattered, and that was enough. Because the wheel did not need enchantment or legend to be remembered. It had its own power in wood and iron, in silence and sound, in the slow turning of something that was once human, now reduced to a warning nailed against the sky. In some regions, the executioner would then thread the broken limbs through the spaces between the wheel's spokes, weaving the body into the wood itself like a grotesque tapestry, tying it down with cords or chains, so that the shattered man became part of the wheel, no longer upon it, but within it, and then, with a final heave, the wheel would be hoisted upright, set atop a tall pole or mast, and left there spinning gently in the wind, or stilled by blood and weight, a display, a spectacle, a warning that hung in the sky like a curse, and death did not come quickly. That was the point. Some lingered for hours, others for days, their groans growing faint, their bodies slumping further with each passing hour, until the eyes rolled back, and the breath ceased, and the crows, ever patient, descended to begin the second part of the work, as nature took what man had broken and began piece by piece to remove it. And the people watched. The decree did not fall like a hammer. It hissed, it simmered, it spread, and those who carried it out, those who lit the fires beneath the pot, who chained the condemned to the lifting hooks, who stood beside the cauldron as steam rose like a ghost from its iron lips, did so not in fear of the prisoner, but in obedience to the king. And that perhaps is the most terrible part. Not that people were boiled, but that people were told to boil, that the horror was not the act, but the command, that the sovereign seated on his throne above the law crafted the horror with purpose. There are moments in history, quiet, cruel, often overlooked in the pages of great battles and royal decrees, when the only thing standing between a person and unendurable agony is not justice, not religion, not the will of the people, nor the laws of the land, but a single swing of a hammer, a single strike of a club, a single decision made by a man with blood on his boots and calluses on his hands. The executioner who may or may not choose to deliver what they called with a bitter sort of hope the mercy blow. A final blow to the chest or the skull, meant to end the condemned's suffering before it could stretch into hours or even days. A small kindness granted in a theater built entirely for torment. And though the word mercy sounds gentle, almost soft in the mouth, in this setting it was soaked with sweat and fear, and the sound of bones breaking like twigs underfoot. These executions were not frequent, but they were famous, their rarity giving them weight, their singularity turning them into tales, whispered by those who dared, remembered by those who wished they could forget. And the places where they happened became marked not by plaques or monuments, but by memory, by a sense that something had boiled here once, something that should not have something, that had made the ground uneasy and the wind too quiet. And so the pot was filled, and so the fire was lit, and so the prisoner, often already broken, already begging, already stripped of identity and name and hope, was brought forward not as a man or woman, but as a symbol, as a lesson written in heat. There was no trial here that mattered, no jury. Only the voice of the king echoing through parchment and proclamation. A voice that could speak a man into non-existence, could whisper one word, boil, and the world would obey. For once the wheel had done its work, once the limbs were broken, once the spine had been twisted, once the body had been reduced to a trembling tangle of meat and breath. The executioner had a choice not always written into law, not always spoken aloud, but present nonetheless in the sharp pause before the next move to strike again, this time to kill or to walk away and leave the condemned to die, slowly, naturally, publicly, piece by shattered piece, and the crowd which had come for punishment often turned quietly toward prayer. In that moment, not for the condemned soul, but for their pain to end, because there is a line between justice and horror, and watching someone suffer long past the point of reason tests even the hardiest stomach and the most obedient heart. This was the spectacle of the wheel. Not just the breaking of the body, But the time that followed the slow turn from punishment into decay, from living man into living corpse. And there, lashed to the spokes or splayed across the rim, the condemned would hang arms and legs woven through like the branches of a bent tree. The body slumped into its own agony, the eyes sunken, the mouth slack, the breath rattling in the chest like a loose hinge. And if they were lucky, the executioner had ended it with that final blow. But if not, if that mercy was withheld, then the end could stretch across hours, across dawn and dusk, across the curious eyes of children and the silent prayers of strangers who passed beneath the post and glanced up quickly, ashamed to look, but unable not to. Sometimes it was water, sometimes oil, sometimes even molten lead, if the tale is to be believed. Though that may be myth stitched to memory by centuries of exaggeration. But whatever the liquid, it did its work with dreadful efficiency. First the feet, then the calves, then the thighs, as the body writhed and screamed and bucked against the ropes, the skin instantly blistering, peeling, turning a furious red, then black as the layers of tissue broke down into the bubbling stew, and the voice of the condemned rose in a pitch that could not be sustained, could not be believed, a sound so pure in its agony that even the boldest in the crowd sometimes turned away. And yet they stayed. They always stayed, because to disobey the king was to invite the pot oneself. To question was to risk substitution. And so the ritual proceeded, the screams rose. The crowd watched, some horrified, some thrilled, some simply there, because no one could look away, and the cauldron hissed like a mouth refusing confession. Afterward, when the pot was cooled and the remains pulled out with iron tongs, when the square was empty again, and the fire a faint glow beneath gray ash, the story began to walk from house to house, from village to village, from mother to child. Not always accurately, not always kindly, but always clearly, always with the same message curled in its steam: the king has his ways, the crown can cook justice, and the pot is never far from the fire, and the body that once knew balance and breath and warmth would become something else, twisted, bent, folded upon itself, its limbs no longer aligned, its joints dislocated into grotesque configurations that no longer resembled life. And still the work continued. For the goal was not only to break, but to reshape, to take what was upright and make it crooked, to turn the condemned into something pitiable and monstrous, all at once, a lesson written in splinters and bruises. Waited for the man on the wheel to stop moaning, to stop blinking, to stop twitching every time the wind stirred his torn shirt, or the sun seared another patch of his exposed skin, because even in death the condemned had a role to play. And that role did not end until the entire village had had their fill of his example. Some wept, some prayed, some went home and tried to forget. But most remembered not the name of the man, not the details of the crime, but the sound of the wheel, the shape of the broken body, the stillness that came only after too much time. And they carried those things with them into their dinners, their marriages, their fears, their children's bedsides, whispering lessons not learned in books or churches, but from the hanging shadows of the dead. And the executioner, too, remembered. It was used most often in cases where proof was absent, when confession would not come, when a woman was accused of witchcraft, or a man of lying under sacred oath. And the courts, bereft of evidence but not of certainty, turned to ordeal, to the belief that God would not allow the innocent to suffer unjustly, that he would reach through the veil of the natural world and intervene, bend the laws of gravity and breath to reveal the truth. And so they bound the hands of the accused, and sometimes the feet as well, wound rope around wrist and ankle until the limbs were no longer their own, and led them or dragged them to the edge of the water. The crowd always followed. There is something in water, that has always fascinated and frightened something ancient, something unknowable, something that reflects and swallows something that calms and drowns. And in the medieval world, where the line between natural law and divine will was not just blurred, but often non-existent, it made a strange, terrible sort of sense to turn to water in search of truth, to ask the river, the lake, the still pond. In the woods, not just to cleanse, but to judge, to bear witness, to sin, to receive the accused into its depths, and through silence, through physics misunderstood and misnamed as faith, to answer with a verdict, and that was the root of trial by water, a ritual as old as memory and as cruel as any sharpened blade. They followed out of curiosity, out of tradition, out of the thrill of seeing someone teeter on the edge of death, not in fire or steel, but in something stranger, because the water, for all its calmness, held more mystery than the gallows or the wheel or the axe. And what happened beneath its surface could be claimed as divine, could be used to write not just a judgment, but a story, and stories in a world ruled by fear and faith in equal measure were a kind of power. And then came the moment, awkward, clumsy, often muddy and loud, when the accused, tightly bound and watched by priest and judge and dozens of murmuring villagers, was lowered into the water, or thrown or rolled from a plank like a sack of grain. And in that instant, everything stopped. The shouting, the motion, the very air, because the river was being asked a question, and the people were waiting for its answer. The man or woman, though, it was most often men, would be stripped and stretched across a plank or platform, or sometimes simply laid flat in the dirt. Arms and legs splayed wide in the shape of a starfish or a saint. And the executioner, whose skill in this task was less a talent than a kind of terrible patience, would raise a heavy iron bar, or sometimes the wheel itself, depending on the method, and begin to strike not wildly, not randomly, but systematically, beginning at the ankles, then the shins, then the thighs, then the wrists, elbows, shoulders, until every limb had been broken in multiple places, each blow shattering bone beneath skin with a crack that echoed across the field and into the stomachs of the watching crowd. If the body sank, it was said that the person was innocent, that the water had received them as it would any pure creature, that their soul had not been rejected, that God had not intervened, because he had no need to, but of course to sink is to drown. And unless they were hauled out quickly, and even then, unless the ropes were cut and lungs emptied and breath returned in time, the innocent drowned in proving their innocence. And though some were revived, many were not, and their bodies were carried out, pale and limp, and strangely peaceful, as if vindication were some cold comfort in death. Whether he gave the mercy blow or not, whether he was praised for his swiftness or cursed for his cruelty, whether he slept soundly or drank himself into forgetting, he carried the image, the weight, the memory of the moment when one person's fate hung on the angle of his swing, the strength of his arm, the sound of his conscience whispering too late. Because on the wheel, justice was not blind, it was watching and watched in return, and whether it ended in silence or in one final bone-cracking blow, the story it told was always the same. This pain was chosen. This pain was allowed. This pain was meant to be remembered. There were reasons to withhold mercy, religious, legal, theatrical, for some crimes were considered so black, so vile, that even a slow death was not enough. And the longer the condemned suffered, the more clearly the message was written across the sky. This is what becomes of those who defy the order, who raise hands against kings, who blaspheme, who kill without cause. And so the wheel became not just a device of death, but of narration, a voice that spoke through agony, a paragraph that unfolded bone by bone, joint by joint, until the final punctuation was not silence but wrought. And the people gathered below did more than watch. They waited for the body to go still, waited for the birds to come, waited for the priest to mutter last rites through a cloth held to his face to block the smell. And when it was done, when the floating body was led to the stake, or the sinking body pulled up limp, the crowd did not always go home rejoicing. Sometimes they lingered unsettled, rubbing their arms, as if the water had touched them too, as if the judgment had not been clean, as if the question asked of the river had not truly been answered, only drowned. Because trial by water was not justice, it was a gamble played with breath and buoyancy, with ropes and fear, with silence dressed up as faith. And in that cold embrace, wrapped in the weight of superstition, there was no way to win, only ways to die differently. There were ponds in the Middle Ages, shallow, still edged with reeds, and silence that were never named on maps, never marked with boundary stones or signposts, but were known nonetheless to every child, every whispering housewife, every bent old man who crossed himself when the wind stirred the cattails the wrong way. And these ponds, these quiet, seemingly ordinary circles of water, were feared not because they held monsters or whirlpools or sudden currents, but because they held memories, held secrets, held the stories of women and sometimes men who had been taken there bound and silent, accused of things that could not be proven, things that could not be seen, things that could not be disproved, and lowered into the water. Not as swimmers, but as suspects, not to cleanse, but to confess, and once a pond was used for such a purpose, it was never used for anything else again, because it had seen too much, and it remembered. These were the witches' ponds, not built, but discovered, not created, but claimed places on the edge of town, or deep within the trees, where the ground gave way to stillness, and the surface reflected nothing clearly. And there, beneath the watching eyes of neighbors and judges and priests and trembling children, a woman could be asked to prove that she was not in league with the devil by floating or not floating, depending on the custom, the mood, the interpretation of signs that were never really signs, just accidents of breath and fear and the way a wet dress clings to skin. It did not begin with screaming. It began with suspicion, with milk spoiling too fast, with crops failing while a neighbor's flourished, with a black cat crossing the wrong threshold, with a baby born blue or a storm arriving too soon after a quarrel, and it waited. Because once a pond has tasted accusation, it never forgets. Because once a woman is tied and dropped in whether she floats or sinks, whether she walks away or does not rise again, the water does not absolve it, only records silently forever. Was this done in the Middle Ages? Did Scaphism truly cross into Europe, into castles and courts and dungeons? Historians debate. For the chronicles are quiet. The record's sparse, but even if it did not, the fear of it was there, the idea of it, the possibility, the imagination of a death so passive, so indirect, that no man swung the final blow, no crowd gasped at the end, no priest delivered a final prayer, and in that lack of human touch, the horror became worse. For what does it mean to die not by hatred or judgment, but by neglect, by slow feeding, by becoming food, and even if the full method was not used, the elements of it were. There are records of criminals left bound and exposed in pestilent swamps as punishment, of prisoners in stocks smeared with offal to draw vermin, of men left shackled in shallow pits for weeks, half buried, half forgotten, until maggots did what the court could not. The rope was meant to save them, but not all ropes were strong, and not all hands were quick, and not all decisions were made with the clarity of compassion. The people who watched were not all wicked. Some were afraid. Some were ashamed. Some truly believed they were saving souls, protecting the village from evil, doing what was necessary, in a world too full of hunger and grief and unexplained death. Because when one cannot control disease or weather or fate, it becomes terribly tempting to believe that someone else must be responsible, that somewhere someone is pulling strings with poisoned fingers, and if that person can be found and punished, then maybe the bad luck will stop. And the woman in the pond, because it was so often a woman was that someone. Even in punishment, by starvation, by exposure, by abandonment, there is the whisper of scaphism, the idea that a person might be undone by nature, that no executioner need stain his hands, that punishment could be delegated to the worms. And for the medieval mind, so caught between God and devil, between flesh and spirit, this was not merely death, it was damnation made visible, the slow undoing of the body, mirroring the decay of the soul. The reversal of creation, as if God's breath were being unspoken in slow crawling syllables. Because to be burned is to disappear. To be beheaded is to fall silent. To be broken is to scream and be still. But to be eaten alive is to endure. To feel yourself disappearing. To count the parts that no longer belong to you. And whether it happened once or 100 times or never at all, the fact remains that it was imagined, and in being imagined, it became real in the only way that matters, to fear. It lived in the minds of those who dared to wonder. What if that were me? What if the mercy of flame, of sword, of even the wheel was denied? What if instead I was left to melt, to rot, to crawl in place while things without names whispered beneath my skin? And in that question, scaphism survives not in the dust of courts, but in the corners of thought, where cruelty and curiosity meet. There is a death quieter than hanging, slower than fire, less sudden than sword or axe or fall. A death that unfolds not in the town square or before a judge or beneath the shouting of a crowd, but far from the voices of man out in the still places, where fields forget the names of their owners and forests hum with indifference. A death that is not delivered by hand or rope or flame, but by neglect, by abandonment, by the turning away of society itself, as if the worst punishment was not pain or humiliation, but to be left behind, to be taken bound or broken, or barely breathing, and buried in the wild, not in the sense of being honored with rites and stone and mourning, but in the darker sense, in the sense of being half buried, hastily covered with dirt or stones or brush, just enough to disappear, but not enough to be truly gone. It was a punishment used rarely and quietly, for to abandon a body to the beasts was considered an affront to both God and nature. But that is what made it so feared, not only because it denied a clean death, but because it denied a resting place. And in the medieval imagination, where the afterlife loomed large and purgatory was as vivid as the rising sun, to be buried improperly, to be left unblessed, to be unshriven was to be consigned not merely to pain, but to wandering, to hunger, to a kind of ghosthood, in which one's name was never spoken, and one's soul could not climb toward light or sink toward penance, but only hover forgotten. The condemned, if they were still alive, were taken far from walls, far from churches, far from witnesses led by guards or men paid to be silent, perhaps hooded, perhaps chained. And when they reached a place judged empty enough, a moor, a hollow, the edge of a marsh, they were cast down, not gently, not with ceremony, but with the indifference one reserves for things already considered dead. And there sometimes with their arms bound to their sides, sometimes with their legs shattered, so they could not crawl, they were covered partially with earth, or straw, or branches, and left. Just left. No prayer, no record, no stone. And this death, this slow motion rot from the inside out, might take days, sometimes weeks, during which the condemned would remain partially conscious, partially aware, half mad from pain and thirst, and the crawling sensation of being eaten alive not by lions or blades or executioners, but by the very air, the very filth of the earth, the unnoticed multitudes we crush beneath our boots every day now, given dominion over a man who once stood upright and unafraid. It is easy to forget in a world so full of noise and spectacle that the worst punishment is not always the one with the most blood, sometimes it is the one with the least. The one that starves, the one that lets the world's smaller cruelties do what the courtroom could not bring itself to finish. And in this form of execution, if it can even be called that, there is something that feels both older and colder than the rest. Something prehistoric, something that speaks of a time before justice and structure, when to cast someone out was to kill them not by blade, but by weather, by hunger, by the teeth of the world. In the minds of those who heard of these deaths, the horror was not in the flesh alone, but in the soul, for what happens to a soul when its body is left unburied. What happens when no one says your name again? When no one marks the place where you fell? When your bones are scattered by animals? When your final breath is witnessed only by trees? There was a belief, persistent, whispered, terrifying, that those buried in the wild did not stay buried, that they wandered not as spirits, but as hollows, as shades, without shape, doomed to walk the edges of the villages at night, drawn to firelight and food and prayer, but never able to enter, because they had been cast out, and what is cast out cannot come back in. She was the scapegoat for the chaos of the world, the breathing placeholder for every unanswered prayer. And whether she floated or sank, screamed, or stayed silent, she was almost always doomed the moment her name was spoken, in the wrong tone, in the wrong room, by the wrong person. Sometimes they put a Bible in her hands to weigh her down, as if to force her to confess with gravity. Sometimes they threw her in twice, claiming the first result had been unclear. Sometimes they found something strange in her belongings, a feather, a bone, a dried herb, and took that as proof even after the water had spoken. And sometimes, though rarely, she survived. She was pulled out, gasping, half drowned, declared innocent, and sent home to a house that no longer welcomed her, to a town that watched her like an animal, to a life that had been washed clean of meaning by the very water meant to reveal truth. And the pond, that shallow thing, said nothing. It rippled once. It stilled. According to the old accounts, Persian in origin, but whispered of far beyond, the punishment began not with a wound, nor with flame or steel or rope, but with a pair of boats hollowed and placed one atop the other, like a coffin split lengthwise, into which the condemned was placed naked, with only their head, hands, and feet protruding from the ends. The rest of their body cradled within wood, exposed only in gaps, and then came the milk, and honey, thick, sweet, heavy, not given as mercy, but smeared deliberately across the skin, poured down the throat, until the belly swelled, until the face was slick with stickiness, until the condemned became bait. Just the wind and the waiting, and the certainty that soon the wild things would come, the fox, the crow, the rat, the boar, the nameless scavengers who patrol the borders of civilization, creatures who do not care for guilt or justice or theology, only for hunger, and the body, whether still groaning or long silent, would be reduced slowly, tooth by tooth, beak by beak, hour by hour. There were stories not written, but remembered, of such ends of men whose crimes were so terrible, so vile that even the gallows were denied them. Of women accused of sorcery so powerful, so contagious, that the priest would not come near, that the executioner crossed himself and refused the task. Of thieves, murderers, traitors, excommunicates, whose names were blackened beyond even the church's willingness to forgive. And these were the ones who were taken not to the square, but to the silence beyond the trees. And so even centuries later, some peasants left a crust of bread at the windowsill, or a bowl of milk at the hearth. Not for saints or spirits they loved, but for the forgotten, for the unblessed, for the ones who had died, not by blade or fire or rope, but by the absence of all three. Because in the end, death by abandonment was not just a punishment. It was a sentence to oblivion. And that in a world so shaped by memory and ritual was the most terrible death of all. There are some stories that drift at the edges of recorded history, like smoke at the edge of fire. Not entirely solid, not entirely gone stories. Whispered more than written, repeated more than examined stories that live not because they are confirmed, but because they are unforgettable. And one of these, perhaps the most grotesque, the most foul, the most chilling in its slowness and stillness, is the tale of death by insects, most often associated with the word scaphism, a punishment so vile, so intimate in its decay, that even hardened chroniclers of cruelty retell it with unease. And whether it was truly practiced in the Middle Ages or merely feared, imagined, half-remembered from older lands and darker empires, the idea of it slithered through the medieval mind like the creatures it described, small, persistent, many-limbed, and merciless. It is one thing to die quickly, another to die painfully, and still another colder, lonelier, more quietly cruel to be left to die, slowly not behind stone, in forgotten darkness, nor beneath the earth, in the hush of final rest, but instead to die in the open, hung like an object on display, enclosed, not for safety or protection, but for exposure, for observation, for spectacle. And that was the essence of death in the cage when a man. And it was usually a man, though not always, was locked into a metal frame, skeletal and rusted and shaped vaguely like the human body. Arms, out legs straight, or dangling torso bound in a cradle of iron ribs, and then hoisted above the world upon the walls of a castle, or the gates of a city, or the edge of a well-traveled road, so that everyone who passed might see not just that he had been condemned, but that he was still dying, minute by minute, hour by hour, under sky and wind and sun and silence. But if the body floated, if the ropes held them stiff, and the water could not pull them down, then they were guilty, because the water had rejected them, because their very flesh was repellent to the sacred. And this rejection was read aloud, was recorded, was followed with a second final judgment, which might mean burning or hanging, or worse, depending on the charge and the mood of the crowd, and the fear in the magistrate's eyes. And the cruelest irony the one whispered about afterward in low voices in warm kitchens was that the more desperately a person held their breath, the more still they tried to lie, the more natural their floating seemed, and the more guilty they appeared. And so survival itself became evidence of wickedness, and the instinct to live was punished as though it were confession. Sometimes they tied a Bible around the neck, believing the weight would sanctify the act. The cage was not a place of containment, but a tool of deterioration, a kind of cruel shelf upon which the body was placed and forgotten. And while the man inside it might begin upright, strong, defiant, the slow and relentless truths of the elements would shape him quickly. The cold of night, the dampness of rain, the scalding sun on exposed flesh, the birds that landed first out of curiosity and later out of hunger, the flies that laid eggs in the creases of the eyes and the corners of the mouth, the numbness that spread from the limbs inward as circulation faltered and the muscles collapsed into tremor and stillness. He would not die from a single wound, nor from a verdict of flame or blade. He would die from lack, from the subtraction of all things, no food, no water, no warmth, no company, no words spoken except those he muttered to himself, delirious or pleading, or dreaming of a mercy that would not come. And the cage was always visible. That was its purpose. But when the punishment was starvation, when the man was placed alive in the cage and left to die, not by force, but by nature, the suffering was slower, crueler, drawn out in long sighs and groans and shivers, the body breaking inward instead of outward, the ribs hollowing the eyes, sinking, the mouth parched and cracked and whispering prayers that turned to curses, and then eventually to nothing at all. There were those who cried out for water, for bread, for death. There were those who sang. There were those who wept, who begged the watching crowd, the passing stranger, the sneering guard, to cut them down, to end it, to swing the blade, or light the fire, or anything but this lingering pitiful dissolution that turned man into warning, that stretched the final breath into a slow, echoing fade across a dozen dawns. And still the cage remained, unmoved, unaffected, iron rusting around bone, joints stiffening, stomach gnawing on itself. Sometimes they thrust a pole into the water to test whether the person had allowed themselves to kick or swim, as though any movement were proof of witchcraft, as though stillness were the only acceptable innocence. And the people watching, those who had grown up with stories of witches, of cursed wells of women who summoned storms or stole cows' milk with a whispered word. They did not always cheer, nor did they always cry. Instead, they watched with a kind of quiet, dreadful wonder, because in that moment, the person in the water was not quite human anymore, but something between human and symbol, between sinner and victim. And however the body moved, the water would be blamed or believed. With a woman speaking too loudly, or walking too proudly, or aging without a husband, or healing without permission, or simply being where she was not expected to be. And once the suspicion took root, once the murmur grew legs and lips, the pond waited. The accused would be led there sometimes by a chain, sometimes by nothing more than the momentum of communal fear, the shoving hands of neighbors she once nursed, the shouts of boys who used to bring her flowers, the priest muttering psalms that did not feel like blessings. And she would be tied her hands at her back, her skirts soaked in dew, and as she was lowered into the water, awkwardly, often painfully, the surface would break, not like glass, but like skin folding over her in ripples that spread to the edge and disappeared, as if the pond itself did not want to be part of what was happening. Some floated and were called witches. Some sank and were called innocent if they were lucky enough to be pulled out again. Because this death, if it ever truly existed, was not about injury. It was about attraction, about making the human body into a feast for nature's smallest mouths. And once the man, and it was usually a man condemned for treason, blasphemy, betrayal, was so coated, so bloated, he was left out in the sun upon stagnant waters, or a platform of wood, and the insects came, flies, ants, beetles, wasps, mosquitoes, all drawn not to punish, not to judge, but simply to feed and feed. They did first on the skin, then in the eyes, the ears, the open mouth, and eventually, inevitably, within the body itself, burrowing into every crevice, every fold, every place the honey clung and the milk spoiled, laying eggs, hatching larvae, breeding rot, and the unspoken understanding that this was not simply a killing, it was a countdown, a dismantling, a message in blood, and missing pieces. This is what happens when the law decides you no longer belong in one piece. The wind rattling through the ribs, and beneath it the people passed, some staring, some hurrying, some praying, some pretending not to see, and the children whispered questions their mothers would not answer, and the priests muttered blessings into the breeze. And the executioner, who had not swung a sword or tied a noose but had instead simply walked away, slept soundly, or drank or dreamt of birds with red beaks. For this death required no noise, no act of violence, no crowd to cheer. Only time and silence, and the slow, unkind arithmetic of the body subtracting warmth, subtracting strength, subtracting hope until only bones in a birdcage remained. And still the cage stood, and still it waited. Because once built, the cage did not forget, and in its rusted ribs and empty belly it remembered everyone it had held. And the crowd, once eager for the sight, would sometimes shift uneasily as the ritual continued, as the blood thickened on the platform, as the body sagged, and the human shape gave way to something else. Something broken, half-formed, caught between life and corpse. And the realization crept in, quiet and late, that justice, when stretched too thin, began to resemble the very crimes it sought to punish. Eventually, mercy arrived, if not from the state, then from the executioner's knife slipped across the throat or plunged into the heart to finish what the spectacle had begun, and the crowd, having seen enough, dispersed, carrying with them not only the image of the final act, but the slow horror of everything that came before it. And what lingered was not the death itself, but the memory of its parts, the fingers, the hands, the face, the sound of bones splitting, the wet silence that followed. The ears, the nose, the lips, all could be taken, depending on the crime and the whim of the executioner, whose role in this performance was not simply to kill, but to draw out the killing, to orchestrate the suffering with a craftsman's eye, ensuring that each wound meant something, that each loss was a line in a story, that all would understand that this man had done something so terrible that even his body could not be left whole, that his very form must be rewritten in blood. And still the legs remained, the arms, the feet, the eyes, each a possible offering to the grim altar of vengeance masquerading as law. If there was ever a punishment designed not only to end a life, but to unmake it piece by piece, not with the sudden finality of a hanging, or the spectacle of fire, not with the swift mercy of a sword, nor the slow forgetting of a cage, but with a dreadful, deliberate unraveling of the body, then it was public dismemberment, a ritual of extraction, a ritual of loss where death did not arrive all at once, but was stretched into parts, into digits and limbs, and soft pieces of flesh that were taken one at a time, so that the condemned and all who watched understood not only that he was dying, but how much of him remained, how much could be cut away before the soul escaped the body altogether, and how deeply the spectacle of punishment could be carved into memory when it was performed slowly, methodically, in full view of the world. It was a sentence reserved for crimes deemed not merely unlawful, but uncivil, unthinkable: regicide, treason, betrayal of sacred vows, murder of the innocent, crimes so shocking to the medieval conscience that a single death, a single blow would be considered too small a price. And so the execution was designed to mirror the crime, not just in scale, but in shape, in repetition, in the grinding rhythm of suffering, extended minute after minute, until every part of the body had been touched by the blade. The condemned was brought to a place prepared, a scaffold, a square, a public hall, sometimes even the steps of a cathedral, and there before priests and judges and townsfolk and silent children clutching their mothers' hands, the ritual would begin not with words, not even with a verdict, but with steel. There, dangling from a post or beam, it became not only punishment, but performance, a sermon cast in rust and bone, a grim punctuation mark against the skyline. And as days passed and the man shrank and sagged and rotted within his steel womb, those who walked below would look up and think not only of his crime, but of their own, of the words they had said, and the bread they had stolen, and the thoughts they had hidden. Because the cage did not preach justice, it warned. Sometimes the cage was used to extend a sentence, locking a man within its bars, not to kill him, but to display him after death, hung up not to die, but to decay, his corpse sealed within its iron outline like a grim lantern, casting no light, but a long, cold shadow. And the smell, the shape, the slow collapse of what was once a man would mark the road for weeks, for months, until wind and weather and the gnawing patience of time reduced him to stains and fragments. The fingers went first, sometimes one, sometimes two, taken with a cleaver, or a curved knife severed at the knuckle or base, the hand strapped to a block, or held in iron clamps to prevent the trembling. that would otherwise blur the strike, and the pain, raw, searing instant, was often too much to scream through, and so the condemned would moan or faint or bite through their own tongue while the crowd leaned forward, not cheering, not always but watching, because this was the moment they had come for the proof that justice had hands and was not afraid to use them. Next came the hands themselves, sometimes both at once, sometimes with a pause between a gesture of theater as much as punishment, and with the hands gone, the condemned could no longer beg, no longer clasp in prayer, no longer reach for anything but the end. And yet it did not come. There were accounts not always consistent, but often repeated, of men dismembered in quarters, their limbs removed, one by one, the flesh cauterized, not to spare them, but to keep them alive for the next stage. Of eyes plucked out, not in the frenzy of mob justice, but with surgical coldness. Of tongues removed after confessions had been shouted or cursed. Of torsos opened just enough to wound, never enough to end, and all of it done in public under the gaze of neighbors and strangers alike, because pain is never more useful to power than when it is witnessed. Some executioners gave water between mutilations. Some mocked. Some prayed. Some drank deeply after it was done and said nothing to anyone for days. The brazen bull, if it ever truly existed, was said to be forged entirely of metal, gleaming and lifelike, with smooth flanks, curved horns, and a mouth opened in an eternal, silent bellow. But its belly was hollow, and in that empty space a man could be placed, crouched or forced, flat. The entrance sealed with a heavy door or a pane of iron locked from the outside with bolts thick enough to trap not just the body, but the voice, and beneath the belly of the bull a fire was lit, small at first, then roaring, stoked by men with torches and oil, and as the bronze heated the space within, it became an oven, a tomb not of stone but of sound. Because this was the terrible ingenuity of the device, it did not simply burn, it did not simply kill, it was designed to perform the pain. The image is quiet at first, a clearing. A pair of saplings, straight and tall and green with spring, chosen not for their beauty, but for their flexibility, for their willingness to bend, to stretch under tension, like a bowstring drawn back, and held not by fingers, but by rope, by pegs, by the brute strength of men with mallets and stakes. And it takes time because the wood resists groaning, creaking, reluctant, as though the trees themselves know what is coming, and would rather remain upright innocent, but the ropes are patient, and slowly, across hours or even days, the trees are trained downward, pulled closer to the earth, until they tremble with strain, until their tops almost kiss the grass waiting. Then comes the condemned. Pipes and vents were carved through the bull's skull beneath its nostrils within its throat, so that as the condemned screamed, and they always screamed, their cries would rise, twist, echo, through bronze chambers, and emerge from the bull's mouth as a howl, a bellow, a song of agony reshaped and disguised music made from misery, and those who stood outside would nod and murmur, and sometimes even laugh, marveling at the invention, never quite hearing the words behind the notes. The prayers for mercy, the names of mothers, the gasps for breath. Only the roar of the beast, theatrical and terrible, echoing across the square like the world itself weeping. Whether or not the brazen bull was used in medieval courts is debated. Its roots are older than Christ, older than Rome. But its story haunted the medieval world, passed from monk to scribe to peasant, to judge, reappearing in woodcuts and sermons in dreams, where bronze glowed and skin crackled, and no door could be opened. And even if no bull stood in a medieval courtyard, the idea of it did the dream of it, the nightmare of pain disguised as art. Stripped, trembling, already pale from what he has heard, for this is not a punishment, unknown, only unbelieved, spoken of in taverns, with a nervous laugh murmured by firelight, as one of those old, horrible tales that can't quite be real until the moment he is led into the clearing and sees the trees, sees the ropes, sees the stakes and the blank stares of the men who do this not out of rage but out of duty, and realizes that it is real and that it is for him. The wrists are tied to one tree, the ankles to the other, and the body, a body that once stood, once danced, once walked to market, and held its child and waved farewell, is now a rope itself, a tether that between two green things made monstrous not by poison or fire but by simple human hands. And when the stakes are pulled, when the ropes are cut, there is no warning, no countdown, no prayer. And in that idea, in that imagined horror, something true remains. Because the Middle Ages understood the power of transformation, not just of sin into punishment, but of suffering into message of voice, into warning of the human body, into something that could still be heard after it had been silenced, and whether by pipe or platform, whether by cage or cleaver or crowd, the condemned were always made to speak, even when they were beyond speech, and the brazen bull was simply a sharpened version of that same truth, that justice could echo and the echo could outlive the body. And the body inside would not be whole, not flesh, but ash, not man, but remains curled in the fetal position, the skin fused to metal, the teeth bared in a final note the world no longer needed to hear. And the crowd would go home, and the fire would be swept, and the bull would wait, not breathing, not moving, but listening, always listening. To die in such a device, if any ever did, was not just to be killed, but to be performed, to have one's death composed, note by note, breath by burning breath, as though the final scream could be turned into proof, into beauty, into order. And that is perhaps what makes the bull, whether real or imagined, so chilling that it represents not chaos or vengeance, but design, that it was built not in fury, but in calculation, not to lose control, but to maintain it, to organize suffering, to shape it into something the state, the church, the ruler could point to and say, this is what happens when you disobey. And the person within the bull, who were they? A heretic, a rebel, a thief too clever, a priest too proud, it does not matter. The story never remembers the name, only the shape, the bull, the fire, the scream. And in the end, the bronze would cool, the door would creak open. They were the ones who hung, but did not break their necks, stretched, but not snapped their eyes, bulging, and faces darkening, but breath still crawling in and out, in shallow, rattling gasps, while their feet jerked and their heels scraped air, and the people watched and wondered if someone should step in, if someone should finish it, if someone should say a prayer, or turn away, or close the child's eyes. But no one moved, and the dying continued, and the execution designed to teach justice became instead a lesson in doubt. Or they were the ones who burned, but too slowly, the wood damp, the wind shifting the flames, licking instead of devouring, so that the body cooked instead of igniting. And the screams rose not once but again and again, rising and breaking and rising again, until the crowd began to shift, to murmur, to feel their own faces redden with shame, not for the condemned, but for themselves, for their watching, for their waiting, for the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this had gone too far, even by medieval standards, and still the fire burned. In all the terrible methods that the Middle Ages devised to punish correct control, or terrify in fire and blade, in cage and rope, in wheel and stake and tree. Perhaps the cruelest deaths of all were not those most brutal in design, but those that failed, those that went wrong. Not by mercy, but by mistake, when a blow missed or a knot slipped or a fire sputtered instead of roaring. When the act of execution, meant to be final and fearsome, faltered just enough to let time back in. And what should have been a clean end became instead a lingering, a death with no dignity, no purpose, no clear shape, just pain stretched out over minutes or hours or days. While the crowd stared, the executioner cursed, and the condemned learned what it meant to be caught between the living and the dead. Or they were beheaded with dull blades, struck once, twice, 3 times, sometimes more. The axe thudding into bone, sliding off tendon, splitting hair and jaw and muscle, but never quite reaching the place it needed to, and the condemned, half dead, half aware, slumped forward, blood pumping in slow waves, the body twitching with the last electric confusion of a nervous system that could not decide whether it had died, and the headsman's face went pale, and the crowd looked away, and the dignity of death, the precision of punishment, collapsed into mess. These were not famous deaths. They did not become paintings. They were not preserved in stained glass. But they were remembered by the witnesses, by the children, too young to forget, by the executioners who drank harder that night, by the priests who doubted their prayers had been heard. And in those cases, the rarest but the worst, the Middle Ages met its own mirror, saw its own cruelty exposed not in pain, but in failure, in a punishment that tried to be perfect and wasn't. And so the body died later than planned, and the soul, if it escaped exhausted. And the lesson, if there was one, was not what the crowd expected. And now, dear listener, the torches burn lower, and the hammer has been set down, and the shouting of the crowd is far behind us, faded into the stone and straw and silence of night. And you who have journeyed with me through so many shadows, through so many shapes of pain and punishment, through so many strange echoes of justice shaped in rope and fire and steel, you may now at last set those images down and let your breath grow slower, your thoughts softer, your pulse lighter. And in these moments, the idea of justice became clouded, because if death could fail, if punishment could miss its mark, if the fire could stutter and the blade could bounce, then perhaps God was not watching, or worse, perhaps he was and simply let it happen. The Middle Ages were built on belief in order, in sin, in punishment. But when that punishment slipped, even a little, everything trembled. And the condemned in their final jagged moments knew not peace, not forgiveness, not even fear, but the terrible recognition that their death, their grand and terrible death, had not become a lesson or a legend, but a mistake, a mishandled ending, a botched silence, and all they could do was bleed or burn or gasp until someone stepped forward and ended it properly or didn't. Because sometimes they were left, and sometimes they survived long enough to crawl, to speak, to beg for the ending they had already been promised. Let the faces fade, not because they do not deserve remembering, but because your body, your heart, your mind must rest now, and to carry every wheel and cage and flame into the dark with you would be too much, even for the strongest soul. Let the bull go silent. Let the rope grow slack. Let the fire burn itself to ash, and let the ash be carried off by the wind. And let the condemned, however guilty, however lost, lie still and be for once undisturbed. You are safe here. You are not judged. The law sleeps now, and so may you. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your body fall gently back into the bed it knows. Let your limbs be heavy, your thoughts like feathers drifting on a still pond. There is no crowd here, no sentence to pass. Only the quiet, only the dark. Only the hush that comes when even the executioner has laid down his hood and hung up his blade and gone home to dream of softer things. Sleep now, dear one. Sleep. Not all punishments from the ancient world vanished with the collapse of empire and the crumbling of marble halls. Some lived on not in stone or scroll, but in story, in whispered warnings, in the deep shadows of the medieval imagination. And few of these were more terrible, more surreal, more theatrically cruel than the tale of the brazen bull, a hollow sculpture of a beast cast in glowing bronze, made not for worship or parade, but for death. And though the origins of the bull lie far from the forests and cathedrals of medieval Europe, in the courts of tyrants and the deserts of forgotten kings, the idea of it, the horror of it, the inescapable logic of its suffering crept westward like a shadow and settled into dreams, into the darker corners of dungeons and the darker corners of the mind, where execution was not only about ending life, but about transforming it into a spectacle of grotesque sound. There are executions that involve the human hand, the headsman's axe, the tightening noose, the flame guided by torchlight. And then there are those that step aside, that relinquish the final motion to something older, colder, stronger, as though the world itself were asked to judge, to act, to complete the sentence not with blade or fire, but with roots, with trunks, with the slow, coiled tension of wood wound tight against its will, and then released violently suddenly, as in the case of execution by tree, a rare and terrible form of punishment, in which the condemned was not hanged or broken or bled, but rather pulled apart by the strength of the forest, by nature transformed into violence, by two young trees bent and bound, tied down to the ground, like bowed heads before a prayer that would never be heard. Because this death, like all deaths in this dark theater of punishment, was about message, about making the body speak even after the voice had gone, and what it said was simple and awful. There is no corner of the world where you can hide from judgment, not even in the woods, not even among the trees. Some say it was used on traitors, on spies, on enemies too dangerous to leave whole even in death. Others claim it was a sentence of spectacle, a way to punish not only the criminal, but memory itself, to create an execution that could never be forgotten, one so unnatural that it must have been ordained by God or devil or both, and thus must not be questioned. And those who witnessed it, whether in forest or courtyard or field, carried the image with them, not because they chose to, but because they could not help it. The image of arms pulled in one direction, legs in another, the soft final moment when the body surrendered to force and the trees stood tall again, shaking, as if even they regretted what they had been made to do. Only the whip of tree against air, the instant uncoiling of tension, and the sound not one but two as the trunks snap upright, returning to their rightful shape, and the body between them tears, rips, snaps, not always cleanly, not always at once, but inevitably, impossibly, with a violence that no sword could match. Because this death is not delivered from above, nor from below, but sideways, as if the body is being erased horizontally, drawn and quartered by the will of the forest. There are accounts scattered second-hand that speak of the spine splitting of limbs, torn clean away of entrails hanging in air for a heartbeat, before falling to earth with a sound no one writes down, of the crowd gasping, not with outrage but wonder, because this was a death not merely seen but felt, a reminder that even wood can be a weapon, that even trees can be turned to torture when men have run out of iron.